Hello, and welcome to this evening's event, Worship and Spirituality in the COVID Era, a conversation between a Catholic and a Jew. I'm Arthur Urbano, professor of theology at Providence College and chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee, JCTE for short. And the JCTE brings you today's dialogue. The JCTE committee has been organizing interreligious dialogues and other events on the Providence College campus since 2007. And in 2009, we inaugurated our twice yearly series, Theological Exchange between Catholics and Jews. You can learn more about our work on our website, jewish-catholic.providence.edu, and by following us on Twitter at JewsCatholicsPC. If you'd like to receive information about future events by email, or you would like to make a donation to help us continue our work, you can contact me at aurbano@providence.edu. And I should mention as well that these events take place because of the generosity of our donors, who are Christians and Jews, alumni and friends of Providence College. And I can see from the list that many of you are here with us this evening watching, and we owe you many, many thanks for your support. This year, because of COVID-19, we all find ourselves doing things differently. This includes these gatherings. We normally have a nice reception and wonderful conversation around these events. But this year we can't do that, and we have to meet virtually. And thank God for the technology. COVID-19 has also impacted the ways we worship and the ways we experience religious community. Our two panelists today will talk about how COVID has changed and transformed worship and spirituality, for better and for worse, in their own traditions and in their own experiences. Our two panelists this evening are Dr. Deborah Johnson, who is Professor Emerita of Modern and Contemporary Art History at Providence College and co-founder of the Women's and Gender Studies Department. She also holds a certificate in Jewish sacred music and cantorial studies from Hebrew College. And her scholarly work has often combined her dual interests and training in Jewish music and modern material culture. Since 2015, Dr. Johnson has served as the cantor of Temple Sinai in Cranston, Rhode Island. And for several years, she was a member of the JCTE committee. Margaret Felice is a religious educator, writer, actress, and a professionally trained singer who lives in the Boston area. She has a particular interest in sacred music and has performed at Tanglewood, Carnegie Hall, and Boston Symphony Hall. She's also the assistant director of the Liturgy Arts Group at Boston College. She's active in Catholic music ministry and conducts several liturgical choirs. She writes about faith, spirituality, music, and a host of other topics on her blog, which you can find at margaretfelice.com. If you have questions for our panelists during the event, I invite you to enter them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time towards the end of the evening, after each of our panelists give a short presentation and spend some time with each other in conversation. We'll have some time for your questions. Our event is being recorded and it will be posted on our website. Now, before I hand the floor over to our speakers, I'd like to acknowledge two significant anniversaries this week. Yesterday, October 28th, marked the 55th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, the Vatican document which has made interreligious events such as this one possible. And on a more tragic note, October 27th marked the second anniversary of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. The confluence of these anniversaries reminds us of the importance of fostering interreligious dialogue and friendship. And it also reminds us of the work that we all still have to do. So now I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Johnson, who will get us started this evening. Dr. Johnson, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you, Arthur. You are such a treasure and blessing to all of the folks you know, and of course to our beloved Providence College. Thank you very much for being you. We all were, of course, shocked and saddened to realize that places of worship are, and they would indeed prove to be, major super spreading centers for the coronavirus. The reasons for this are many, including the physical closeness of our congregants during worship, The fact that services are conducted indoors in stagnant air over a fairly long stretch of time, and that the activity of singing, not only the cantor singing, but our congregants singing, was the most dangerous factor of all. So let's talk a little bit about what's wrong with singing. Mostly everything is right with singing, except in the context of this virus. The air that travels out of our bodies is not dry, whether we're breathing, coughing, talking, or singing. The most worrisome element in this wet air are aerosols, because aerosol particles are small enough that they can disperse up to a distance of 27 feet and linger for up to 12 hours in calm air. And I know I'm probably making everybody even more nervous than we all are at this point. Calm air, one might assume that movemented air would be better, but if you're indoors, if the space where the aerosols are present indoors has an HVA system or a draft even that's circulating air, aerosols can stay buoyant for an indeterminate amount of time. Because aerosol particles can hang in the air for so long, theoretically, a person can walk through an aerosol cloud hours later and breathe in those particles. And because the particles are so small, they can travel into a person's lungs more easily than more obvious culprits like viral droplets. For these reasons, this week, the CDC revised earlier guidelines that cautioned us, I'm sure we remember, against close contact of more than 15 minutes with a single individual or group. It is no longer the case now. Those 15 minutes are cumulative over the course of 24 hours. In other words, the threat or potential of threat to encounter aerosolized particles is great enough that we need to amortize the amount of time we spend potentially in someone else's air for a maximum of 15 minutes over the course of 24 hours. Back to singing. Because of the deep breathing and vocal projection implicit in singing, singing expels more aerosolized air than almost any other activity, which is why choir practices and houses of worship have proven to be super spreading sites. Now, churches and synagogues have had, by and large, a markedly different response to these challenges. Churches have tended to adhere closely to state regulations, and I suspect Margaret will enlighten us a bit more about that. And in our state, these regulations have allowed for communal worship at 66% capacity for up to 125 people with 6-foot spacing and masking. That being said, the majority of synagogue buildings have remained closed. This is not in response to laws of the state of Rhode Island, which would allow us to open if in modified form. But according to guidance from a Jewish law, that there is no imperative greater than saving a life. This law is known as Pikuach HaNefesh, literally saving a life, and it dictates that one may override almost any other commandment or mitzvah, and we have 613 of them, in order to save a life. Now, there's a hint of this principle in the Torah, the Jewish Bible, in Leviticus and Ezekiel, the latter of which states, quote, "And I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if one does, one shall live in them," unquote. Now, as dense or apparently ambiguous as that quotation may be, the implication is that Jews must live by Torah law rather than die because of it. But it's in the Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, and the primary source of Jewish religious law, known as halakha, that is unequivocating. There are several stories in the Talmud that illustrate this, but one story I shared in a recent course on pandemics was that of the 19th century Talmudic scholar named Israel Salanter. When a cholera, and this is a true story, theoretically, when a cholera epidemic broke out in his city of Vilna, Lithuania in 1848, reaching its peak just before Yom Kippur, Rabbi Salanter went himself to all of the synagogues in the city to announce that people should not fast, and fasting is the central practice on Yom Kippur. Should not fast so as not to weaken themselves. And he also advised and encouraged that synagogue services either be shortened or eliminated over the high holidays, no less. The next morning, on Yom Kippur, he went even further. He did the unthinkable. He stood at the front of the synagogue with wine and bread and ate in front of the congregation, teaching a lesson on the Talmudic principle of Pikuach HaNefesh. Now, to be sure, this principle has limitations, and these have accounted, at least in part, for the varying responses of liberal Jews and Orthodox Jews. For example, questions linger as to what constitutes a life-threatening situation and whether the individual whose life is to be saved must be specifically identifiable rather than abstract or aggregate. So I have on more than one occasion been sharing Shabbat dinner with observant Orthodox friends, one of whom is a physician, and in the middle of dinner, he's been called away to the ER, and off he goes, technically breaking several commandments, except for Pikuach HaNefesh. Similarly, while the Orthodox Union, the oversight organization of Orthodox Jews, has not called for elimination or electronic transmission of services, requirements for behaviors while gathered for worship are very stringently delineated. This all brings us to the heart of Arthur's prompt, worship in the COVID era. My synagogue, Temple Sinai in Cranston, yay, under the leadership of Rabbi Jeffrey Goldwasser, double yay, has, like the overwhelming majority of liberal synagogues across the country, remained closed. I sit now in our sanctuary, our beautiful sanctuary, which has been empty of our congregation since March. In fact, as Rabbi Goldwasser pointed out, as he and I faced an empty sanctuary recording our high holiday services, and I quote him here, Pikuach HaNefesh includes wearing masks in public, maintaining social distance, and staying home. It also means that in order to save lives, we all have to be willing to go the extra mile to speak up and take action against life-threatening situations. We need to be mindful of the dangers facing medical providers, health and public safety professionals, custodian and sanitation workers, teachers, and others who are on the front line of this public health crisis, unquote. But it's very important to clarify that even as we have shuttered our building for the time being, we have not closed our congregation. Using a variety of interactive Zoom platforms and live streaming devices, we have not only continued our worship services, but continued, recorded, and uploaded them on our temple website, along with a wide array of adult education classes, holiday celebrations, and general resources. And like many other congregations, we've seen significant surges in attendance at our services. Now, an important question, of course, is, do our congregants miss seeing each other in person, face to face? Of course they do. And I miss them terribly. As the old Jewish joke goes, I don't come to temple to talk to God, I come to talk to Sam Goldberg. But we've also discovered a very special intimacy that we've not shared before. Now, mind you, like many of you out there, I assume, I adapted my courses to Zoom last spring for my last semester at PC. And I would not say that there was a new and refreshing intimacy for which we were all grateful. I hope it's different this semester. But there's something to be said about seeing our congregants in their element, in their sweats, snuggling their pets, other family members walking around in the background. And this privilege, because a privilege it is, can only be called intimate. I would like to ask you to listen to what some of our congregants have said about our Zoom services. So, one congregant wrote, quote, "The Zoom services have truly been so enjoyable and were such a welcome addition to this stressful year. They are a wonderful way for us to maintain our connection to the temple and to enjoy seeing our temple family." Or another congregant, "The highlight of the coronavirus has been the Zoom services from temple. We look forward to services and the social groups after services. It's been especially good for my husband, who goes out very little. He's able to see and chat with people. After COVID is cured, God willing, and Temple Sinai has reopened, my hope is that Zoom services continue." This particular woman went on to say, and don't worry, Sue, I will maintain your complete anonymity, quote, "Where else can you go to services in your nightgown and eat dinner all at the same time?" More specifically, one congregant said, quote, "Listening and chatting on the computer does not replace a hug or sitting with others, but I'm surprised by the level of bonding and intimacy it has brought. We're not rushing to leave because we have to drive. And I think we've gotten closer through this medium and learned more about each other." Finally, one young congregant said it all, I think. She said, "I have found new meaning in the services, even though it's Zoom. Just proves prayer can be done anywhere," unquote. So, allow me to modify how I began this little presentation. My synagogue isn't closed. It's open, because my synagogue is not a building, it's people. People who are participating with those who are struggling medically, financially, emotionally, and who are helping each other by becoming actively involved in their lives, close up and personal. I loved the way one rabbi put it. He said, "My synagogue has never closed. It just opened in every home." For these reasons, I'm not sure the most interesting question is, how do we do worship now? Because I think we are doing it, and I think we're doing it well, if remotely. I think the question is, and this is where I'd like to end, how will we meet the future with these new skills and tools at the ready? And is it possible that these new skills and tools are the proverbial blessing in disguise?
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson, for your reflection. And now we'll move on to Margaret Felice. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Arthur. And thank you, Deborah, for welcoming us into your beautiful sanctuary and into your heart and your reflections in that way. It was inspiring and conveniently had some nice segues into some of the thoughts that I have been having. So that is always a plus. Before I begin, I want to give the standard disclaimers that I'm speaking from a particular experience in the Archdiocese of Boston. In Massachusetts, places of worship were permitted to reopen fairly early, and the Archdiocese did, with a number of health protocols in place, similar spacing guidelines to the ones Deborah mentioned for Rhode Island, mask mandates, many changes to the ritual that were put in place in order to prevent the spread of COVID or any disease, and a dispensation that the faithful were not required to attend Mass in person, and that continues to be the case in the Archdiocese of Boston, and thankfully in most archdioceses around the country. So I speak from my particular experience as someone who works at a college and at a high school and at a particular parish in South Boston, Massachusetts. But I am also someone who's always been a little nosy and I like to find out what's happening in other places. So I feel like I've had a number of wonderful conversations and had the chance to fill in and attend some different services over the last few months to give a slightly bigger perspective. But I should say from the beginning that I'm speaking for myself. But to go back to one of the last quotes that Deborah shared from a congregant about finding new meaning. And I think what has been really revelatory for me, observing the way that my friends and family and neighbors have responded to the changes in worship, which again, I agree with Deborah. I think we're doing worship and we're doing worship well, and in a way that brings life and meaning to a lot of people, has been deconstructing a little bit what worship means to us. Sometimes I think what is essential, I think essential might be too absolutist, but what matters to us in worship? What are our values? What are our priorities? And I think people have determined that they're different for different people in their environments. Of course, the primacy is communion with God, and in Catholic worship, in normal times, it's also encountering the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which when we were closed, and for many people who still don't feel comfortable returning to in-person worship, that's not something that we can experience in the same way that we did prior to the pandemic. So I've noticed a number of sort of threads that have emerged as different areas of focus for people as they determine how they're going to sustain their spirituality and feed their spirituality throughout this time. I think for some, the liturgy was a place of great creativity. For probably most people, that's the only place they sing. And they might sing once a week, either in the choir or out in the assembly. It might be the only place they encounter art. It might be the only place they encounter literature. And to have that taken away, I think was hard for a number of people, and maybe they pivoted towards prayer activities that would allow them to express themselves and continue to encounter beauty and express creativity. Many people, of course, as Deborah mentioned, come for community. One of the most interesting and beautiful things that I observed during a Facebook Mass that was being broadcast from the chapel at Boston College High School, where I work as a teacher of religion and music, was at the sign of peace, the traditional time when folks give a wave or shake hands or hug the people near them. People were typing peace into the chat. And maybe it was a lack of imagination on my part. I hadn't expected that to happen, but those couple moments where people would type amen or people would type thanks be to God after the dismissal really showed for me both the power of humans to connect and to be creative about how they connect in difficult times and the need that we have to connect. Some people, the preaching is really a priority for them. And I know some of my aunts and uncles, who I won't name their parishes for fear of maybe getting them in trouble with their pastor or their parish priest, have been watching other live streams because they found preachers who offer them some insight or some meaning through their preaching. And of course, encountering the scripture, I know of many families, often those which already have a strong sense of community in the home. I don't hear this as much from people who live alone, who have done their own worship services. They'll pray the liturgy of the word together with their family, and they'll sing a song together with their family. And that will be their worship, perhaps at the same time that was routine to them, but not zooming in, not connecting with their parish at least weekly, but doing something more intimate and more family oriented that had them a little more actively engaged in specifically the scriptural aspect of worship. So I continue to think about all of those things. And I also love the way that Deborah concluded by thinking, what will we do new? What will we do moving forward, knowing what we know now? We know that it's unlikely that things will go back to the way that they were. And that's probably a good thing, because shakeups can be good. Unfortunately, this one was so tragic, but we can find on the other side of it innovation and new life and new inspiration in our worship. I know I find in my teaching, thinking about directing a liturgical choir at a high school, I had to really, again, I'll use this term, deconstruct what were the objectives of my course? What was it I was trying to do with this ensemble? It's also a fine arts course, which is why I use that language and think about, okay, we want to give a place for students to connect. We want to help them learn about music, and we want them to be available to enhance public prayer or public worship if we have that during the school year. And because we are on a hybrid model where I do see kids on a weekly basis, we got some inexpensive hand chimes, and we became a hand chime choir for the year, while singing is still so dangerous, as Deborah described. So the very act of stepping back and analyzing the motivations and the outcomes and the priorities of how we express our spirituality and how we worship, I think can be really powerful, and I think will be something that a lot of us hold on to moving forward. I know from a musical perspective, obviously it's been quite challenging knowing that the thing that I've really given my life to, if I look from 10,000 feet and I look at many of the things I've been involved with, I've really given my life to encouraging people to sing. And now that's not safe. And that really threw me for a loop for a while. And it was traumatic in its way. And I know it was for many other singers, and certainly many other music ministers as well. So dealing with that shift from the thing I thought was the most beautiful and one of the most fantastic ways to connect with God, to overnight learning that it was dangerous. If I encouraged people to do this, I would be putting them in danger, was really challenging. There were also ways, and I know I saw some of the names of the participants, and I know that I have some partners in music ministry on this call, that it encouraged me to think about where my voice fits in and what to do with my voice when I am not leading congregational singing, in which case I'm trying to disappear. I had a moment during a worship service over the summer when I was chanting the Gloria, one of the pieces of ritual music that's sung at the beginning of the Catholic Mass. And I was really struck by the idea that in that moment, I was the voice of the congregation in a way that I generally avoid in my ministry. And it caused me to feel a different sort of connection with the congregation, and a really powerful sense of what ministry could be and what it might require of me in this time. And there were also these times, as Deborah mentioned, of singing to an empty church that were painful and bizarre, but at the same time knowing that not only did I have friends and former classmates, I had family members from around the country who were connected through this technology, which we've been so right to laud in how it allows us to come together, that made it new and made it different and made it maybe not so bad as it could have been. So again, I'm grateful to Arthur for inviting me and Deborah for sharing her experiences and the folks behind the scenes who are working on this. So I'm happy to turn it back over to Arthur for our next segment.
All right, thank you so much, Margaret. And I'll ask Deborah to make herself visible again. So we'll move now to a conversation, and in a way, Margaret has already sort of commented on some of the things that you've said, Deborah. And see some of the of what saying, but there are also ways in which they kind of move in sort of different directions as well. So I would just like to hand it over to both of you now to take a few minutes to talk with each other, ask each other questions, or comment on anything that the other has said. Yeah, Deborah, why don't you get us started?
I'd love to ask Margaret a question, and I'm stealing Sam Grabell's question because I think it's an excellent one, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to have Margaret respond to it since she's an educator. He asks if our children are getting enough of a religious education now. It's clearly not the same, but how do we feel about whether or not it's enough, or are they really missing out? And I really would like to hear what Margaret has to say about that as an educator.
Well, if you'll allow me to be provocative, it's certainly possible they weren't getting enough before either. I think this highlights the centrality of catechesis in the family. And I know that things vary so much in different locations and different parishes and different situations. And my hope is that most feel empowered and provided with the resources by their parish that they would need in order to expand religious education beyond what happens in the church basement to what might happen in the home. Perhaps this is a wake-up call. I think that's a great question, and I think it's a very valid concern. I'm hesitant to speak in too much of specifics because so many situations are so different. But I guess I would leave it at that I think it has really reminded us that it has to begin in the home, and the resource that the parish provides, while it often, but not always, comes with a level of expertise along with it, it can't be the entirety of a student's formation.
We're engaged right now as a temple in attempting to determine how much education is enough. Where's the proper level? So that was very well put, Margaret. But I'm also, as we're talking, conducting a private chat with Celia Devine, and she talked about the necessity for physical presence in so much Catholic ritual that really is absent in Judaism. Yes, there is a commandment to put yourself in a room and pray with Jews, and yes, we're supposed to pray in a minyan of 10 people, but in fact, for a variety of socio-political reasons, Judaism is very comfortably practiced at home. There's even the phrase Mikdash Me'at, meaning the altar in the home. And so there's a certain comfort level with being a good and observant Jew in the embrace of your family and your own house.
Yeah, and there are elements of this that feel like a penitential fast. Many were fasting from the Eucharist in a way that was uncomfortable and now has gone on for quite a while. I want to laud so many of the priests and parishes that have found ways for individuals to encounter the sacraments safely, outdoor adoration, outdoor penance and reconciliation, drive-up confession, recognizing this hunger. But I admire and value the bishops who I believe have acted pastorally in encouraging us to take up our cross in this matter and wait until it can be truly safe. And I want to follow up on something else you said, Deborah, because I did have another question for you as you were mentioning the comfort level with, I guess praying remotely is the modern way to say it, but of course it's not so much of a buzzword. What are other ways that your congregation has kept folks engaged? You know, some places have used email newsletters or online fora. What are some other ways that you've encouraged community?
Mm-hmm. For a small to mid-sized congregation, I think we're incredibly active. yes, we have provided our services, holiday celebrations, resources online, on our website, through our newsletters, through our rabbi does a weekly newsletter in addition to our general monthly newsletter, in which we talk about what we're doing, but also we talk about issues. We bring up issues, we talk about what's going on in the community, but we also have a full array of adult education classes, ranging from we're about to begin an Israeli film series, to discussions of, for instance, liturgy. In addition to that, much of our Hebrew and religious school is online, and there's lots of stuff going on there as well. So I think when I asked my congregants over email what's been good in what we've been doing, and by we, I don't mean just the clergy, I mean all of us, when they talked so much about actually getting to know people better, I think there was a quantitative and qualitative component to that. We are certainly getting to know people in a different way. Many people mentioned that they find themselves in a virtual room, in a Zoom room with somebody they knew were members of the congregation, but may never have talked to before. But that also the fact that we are doing so much online, I think is really going far to keeping us a community. I think it's also going to be once we are all back on the premises, it's probably going to be tough, or maybe not, to keep up that level of activity and energy. But that folds into that question of what are we going to learn from this experience that we can retain, that keeps this experience of worship and community rich and alive and full.
Yeah, I don't know about you. I already see things evolving, whereas there was this flurry of desire to connect maybe in the spring and over the summer. We're realizing we need to be a little choosier about what we schedule and when we schedule. There's not the appetite for as frequent events, but perhaps there's an appetite for ones that are more targeted. And you also made me think how essential it is to be thinking about these priorities of community and beauty all the time. I had a friend who I was talking to early in the pandemic who works at a parish nearby, who said they didn't have an email list. They had never gotten their email list together. So now it's a pandemic, no one's coming in, and they're trying to piece together from all the different bits of information they had a way to stay in contact. So building whatever structures we can ahead of time allows us to respond more quickly when there's some sort of crisis or issue.
Margaret, do you have a sense now of what things you personally will have learned or have already learned from this experience, or what you think your worship context in general as a whole will take into the future?
I know from a very practical, this is not a well, no, I'll take that back. I think there is a theological element to this, that if you are going, it's not enough to do what you've always done in person and plop an iPhone down in front of it. It worked for the first few weeks, but people started to realize they didn't want to look at somebody standing in the shadows, or someone who was halfway out of the frame, or, sound that wasn't working quite right. So to give myself an out on the theological side of things, I think that just reflects that we, in adapting to whatever circumstances, to do, I hate to say good worship, because you can't judge something like that, means to bring your best to it and to present it in a way that there are few distractions, few unnecessary distractions that will pull people away from what you're trying to draw them into. So I think that the thoughtfulness of how to present virtual content, I've had a number of really interesting conversations about that with music ministers and priests on that topic. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. How about you?
I'm surprised actually that our concerns and thoughts are so very parallel. Yeah, we're certainly wondering how we are going to retain the best of this virtual situation once we all are present again. I think a lot about what it means to be in front of the congregation as a person versus in front of the congregation um, in front of the camera, through the camera. Um, since I tend to embrace music and experiences that are really participatory, it's been very hard to translate that into the virtual arena. I've come up with certain devices where I'm choosing lots of prayers, singable prayers from many other traditions that are simple, and that include response, call and response. And I've, developed this gesture of I'm singing now, it's time for you to sing, and I can see people's voices, mouths moving, so I know it's actually happening. But at some point at the end of all of this, I do look forward to sitting down with my rabbi actually and talking about not merely the technical stuff, that we are certainly going to get a handle on what we need to retain in that case, and there is certainly consensus that we need to retain a virtual element even when we've got folks back in the pews. But to talk about the nature of worship and what was working when we were virtual, when we were moving to greater simplicity, shorter services, because how long can somebody put themselves in front of a computer screen? What can we retain from that, even as we are no longer virtual? I think it's an exciting moment, an exciting time, and it's exciting to think about. We're all obviously facing challenges around attendance and commitment and developing a younger cohort, and this is. I'm terribly sorry it has to be in the context of a terrible, deadly virus, but it is making us think about worship in a wholly new way. And I think that's going to be good.
Yeah, I think you and I might have a similar inclination towards hope, even in these hard times. I think, yeah, I agree. There's new life coming. And I've always thought, my mother tells a story. I ran into many years ago a student who was a classmate in religious ed when my mother was teaching it when we were in second grade. And he said to me, oh, it's Margaret, tell your mom I said hi, but don't tell her I don't believe in the Trinity anymore. And I told the joke to my mother, and my mother said, I'm just thrilled he's thinking about the Trinity, just asking the questions. It's uncomfortable. We're leaning into mystery at this moment, and we're leaning into uncertainty, and that is deeply uncomfortable, but wow, what we might find on the other side.
Yeah. Arthur, what's your experience as a congregant?
Well, so my wife and I have been following Mass at our parish, and we've also kind of been doing the little shopping around, watching some other parishes. My wife's childhood parish in another state, and we've also sort of tuned into some liturgies in Italy as well to sort of transport us there back to our sort of our homeland in a sense. But we've been very grateful to have that experience for various reasons. We're not ready to go back to in-person worship, but my parish is doing a fine job with broadcasting the masses there on Facebook. And so we've been very grateful for the opportunity to be able to not only connect with the Mass and have that opportunity to pray, but also to be able to connect and pray with people we know, with our pastor and our deacon, and the music ministers that I'm involved in music ministry at my parish. And so, I mean, the fact that I haven't sung in months is killing me as well. But I hear their voices. I don't see them, but I hear their voices off to the side, and I know they're there, and so that's greatly comforting. But there's definitely we miss the Eucharist. To go back with what Margaret was talking about, just sort of the Eucharist being such a central, right, the source and summit of the Catholic life. to not be able to partake in that is very difficult. And there's such the sacramental nature of Catholicism with physical elements, filled with God's grace, as channels of God's grace, makes that physical presence and setting very important. So in a way, it's also very unsettling not to have that. But like I said, we're grateful that we're not completely disconnected, and that parishes have made a great effort really to maintain these kinds of availability of prayer to the congregations. And I think looking ahead, you know, once that we get through this pandemic, however we get through it, and we're able to return to our buildings together, I think this also makes us think of those who have various disabilities who aren't able to come to the places of worship physically for various reasons. That this is an opportunity to become more aware of their needs, and how we can, as parishes and synagogues, keep those members of our families connected to worship and to our communities. So, in many ways, it's kind of been a hard hit for everyone, but as you're both saying too, it presents opportunities going forward to kind of rethink some of the things that we do. Yeah. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to invite those who are in attendance to submit any questions they have. I see we have a question or two here. So let me take a look at those and throw some of those questions out on the table. And let me just say, for those of you tuned in, make sure you hang on to the end, because we have a special treat for, well, I should say Margaret and Deborah have a special treat for you coming up at the end that you're not going to want to miss. So please stay tuned. But we have a question here that says, what advice would you give to people who are currently isolated alone, where their church does not do online services? I'd say, I would add, or the synagogue, or are struggling to connect online the way they would do in person. Yeah.
That is so hard. I shouldn't even answer this question. I think by and large, with the exception of traditional synagogues, even before the pandemic, liberal temples were broadcasting their services online. Pardon me. But even online in our interactive Zoom services, there are lonely people. And it is our job as clergy actually to reach out to them and to embrace them, to protect them in their loneliness. But what I've also discovered, I've found out today, a congregant contacted me today and said, I haven't seen so-and-so in services in a long time. I got her email address. I'm gonna contact her to make sure she's okay. And I wrote back and said, you're absolutely right. Can you pass on the email address and I'll do the same? But it's become less a sort of clerical responsibility, and it's a human responsibility, and it's a privileged responsibility, to say the least. So loneliness, aloneness, whether sitting in our congregation or sitting at home, is a terrible byproduct of what we're going through now. We all know that. And it would seem that the virtual platforms are encouraging, and I tried to suggest this in my little presentation, encouraging people to take care of each other in a way that they haven't. It's incredibly humbling.
Yeah, I think if we knew the answer to this, we'd be saving the world right now, because it is it's a big challenge. And I know, a couple little ideas come to mind that could be totally improbable or unattainable in a certain person's circumstances. I know I had some days in the spring where a friend and I would watch the same liturgy and, kind of connect throughout. I shouldn't say text while we were in liturgy, but it was, not as bad as it sounds. I have found a lot of solace in the lectionary readings. So in the Catholic lectionary is universal, and knowing that the liturgical calendar, the liturgical year soldiers on despite the pandemic, and we continue to cycle through these familiar rhythms of the liturgical year, has been some consolation, although it's rather intellectual, of knowing that others are praying in the same way that I am, even if I can't be with them at the time. But that's just hard. I wish I had an answer.
You know, someone, and I'm sure Arthur is, I don't mean to preempt Arthur, but there's a question by someone named Shana Dias who says very beautifully, I believe when you sing, you pray twice. And that is so beautiful. And I think it's so absolutely true. How are you, Margaret, dealing with the loss of that opportunity? And you were talking a bit about it in your presentation, that opportunity to pray twice, to pray deeper, to pray different, to give yourself and your congregation another avenue into the liturgy.
Like everything else, I'm taking it one day at a time. You know, right now, my responsibility is to endure, and later on, my responsibility will be to recover. I do feel a real fear that we will lose that. I mean, communal singing has been so precarious in our culture to begin with, and I work at an all boys high school, so I can tell you it's not their natural state. It's taken a lot of work to get them into that mode. At the same time, I recognize how spoiled and really privileged I've been. I was back singing to empty rooms for virtual liturgies very early on, and I'm able to sing. I'm the one who's up in the front providing some of that in the liturgy, but it's lonely. It was lonely when the church was empty, and sometimes it's lonely when the church is full, and you see people whose maybe their mouths are moving a little bit behind their mask because you know they're kind of singing along, and it makes you worry. So yeah, like everything else, one day at a time, and we'll figure out how to bounce back when we know what that's going to look like.
One of our local priests joked that of all the regulations that were put in place for the resumption of masses, that asking Catholics not to sing would be the easiest one to follow, right? Because unfortunately, right, we already have
very much moved away from passing the peace too. So the idea of only waving and smiling during the passing of peace is pretty, at least at daily mass, that's pretty much where we've been for a while.
Yeah, and that question was Shane is one of our seminarians at Our Lady of Providence.
Yes, I apologize. Not a she at all.
We have another question here from a student, and I'm wondering about this too. Right? The question says, how do you plan on celebrating in your religious services when everything does get back together and things are normal again? Will there be more events in celebration of such an anticipated day? And I've been thinking too, it would be great to see parishes and synagogues, I'm thinking especially with our Catholic parishes, when there's a clear green light, we should be throwing the biggest liturgical celebration, just even in Thanksgiving, right? That we've made it through this. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? What do you see when and if that day comes? What should our communities be doing to celebrate and worship that day?
Well, I'm going to tell you a secret, and you mustn't tell anybody, especially the folks in my congregation. But I have a big birthday coming up very soon, a big birthday. And I had hoped to have a birthday party here at Temple with a klezmer band I used to sing with, and belly dancers, and chocolate desserts, and it basically was going to be my gift to the congregation. To say the least, we are not doing that. But a part of me is hoping we can migrate that over to a kind of opening party. But we're having a meeting very soon on reopening Temple Sinai, and I hope that we can talk a little bit about our party. And by our party, I mean our whole congregational party. Of course, the reality is we know that that it's not going to be a situation in which Monday we're closed and Tuesday we're open. This is going to be a slow process. It's going to be a measured process, at least for Jews. Fauci said, I believe it was yesterday, that with this recent outbreak being so bad, and no real strictures in place, that we may be looking at 2022 before we're embracing anything resembling normalcy. So the party may be a big fantasy, but yeah, in addition to all of the learning, I think that so many of us are going to take away from this, we've got to be celebrating as well that that we figured it out, that we made it through, that we are a community that cares, and a community that grieves together, and a community that celebrates together. That absolutely needs to be marked.
I agree completely. And I'll keep my eye on the mailbox for my invitation to that party, because it sounds like a barn burner. I can't wait. I agree we need to celebrate. And I also think we're learning that we need to partner. We have relied across parishes within our denomination, but also in terms of space sharing and resource sharing and wisdom sharing across traditions. I hope that when we do, and I wish it would be like flipping a switch. I wish there would be a day when they'd be like, okay, we can have a sing along again. But when we do feel comfortable doing that, probably outside first, that it's not just every congregation for themselves, that there's partnership and there's bringing together and there's more shared worship, because I think the connections that folks have formed in our need are beautiful and shouldn't be abandoned.
Yeah, and let me just clarify, these clearly are jokes around Don't Tell My Congregation. There are lots of my beloved congregants out there in cyberspace listening right now, and I love you all, and you'd all be invited as well. This would be our congregational party.
Well, we are coming up on the 7 o'clock mark, and as promised, we have a special treat for everyone here tonight. So I'm gonna have Deborah introduce this as a way of sort of rounding out our event and our discussion tonight.
Well, I hope Arthur hasn't built up your expectations too much, but Margaret and I thought it would be nice to say a blessing, and specifically when we can sing and not make anybody sick, to sing a blessing. And the blessing that we're going to be singing is a blessing that's common to both our traditions. We call it the priestly blessing. It is based on the blessing that Aaron, the first priest, made on the Israelites. And by the Second Temple period, the words that I will sing in Hebrew and Margaret will sing in English were already, at least the Hebrew words were already established. So this is a very ancient blessing. The setting, the musical setting, of course, is not ancient. In fact, when I was looking for some, it's an oral tradition. When I was looking for some sheet music, there was no such thing. So much Jewish music is in fact oral tradition. And I think for that reason, it's also rather special. So we begin. Yivarechecha Adonai ve'yishmerecha.
May God bless you, and may God protect you.
Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chunecha.
May God shine upon you and be gracious to you.
Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Shalom.
May God be with you and bring you peace. And bring you peace. Amen. Amen.
Thank you so much. I'm sure you have to imagine. I'm sure there's a rousing applause on the other side of our computer screen. So let me do a little bit of applause to get that in there. Deborah Johnson, Margaret Felice, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us and having this conversation with us. I also want to thank my colleague, Professor Stephen Long, who's sort of been there behind the scenes helping with the technology, and the college events office as well for helping us put all of this together. And thanks to all of you who have attended this evening. And we look forward to having you at future events. So if you have friends who weren't able to make it, check out our website. The video will be posted there for viewing later. And I wish you all a good evening, and stay healthy and safe.
Thank you, Arthur.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone.